Good evening, everyone. Sunday. Hope all is well at your end. So, after chapter 6, we are here with chapter 7, Audit Sampling.
Recording in progress.
So, how's the Sunday been till now? Yes, as usual, unless and until I see at least 8 to 10 greetings on the query screen, I cannot move ahead with the chapter. I need to know that you all are here with me so that we may start our chapter for the day, Audit Sampling. So before we start with the chapter, have you ever wondered when you go for the blood test, why does the lab person just get 2, 3, 5, 10 milliliters of the blood? Why not get the whole blood to check what are the deficiencies, what is the problem, what are the infections? We always talk about we had given a blood sample and let's see what the report states. That is what sampling is. The blood running through our veins in the body, the whole blood, that is known as the population. And the sample they take out of it for carrying out various tests as directed by us or the doctor, adulteration. What do they do? It could be cereals, flour, anything, food grains. They just take out samples, 50 gram, 100 grams from those particular products, from that particular shop. Send it to the government laboratories to check for any adulterations if the shopkeeper has been resorting to. They don't seal their shop or confiscate the whole food grains or any material which is being sold over there at the shop. This is what sampling is. In our layman language, what do we call it? Sample bhar liya gaya. Right? Sample has been taken by the authorities to check for any wrongdoings. In the same way as an auditor, right? In the same way as an auditor, when we are going for audit, we have certain apprehensions in mind. And in today's era, in the era of digitization, numerous volume of transaction, heavy volume of transactions, right? This particular chapter finds its importance, audit sampling. How do we use that particular process in our audit? Is it safe? Is it mandatory to use this particular technique or method? How far, to what extent can we use this technique? What would the methods? How to apply those methods? What would be the results? How to document those results? How to report upon those results? That is what this chapter 7 tells us about. And of course, essay 530, standard on auditing 530, 530 as well. Audit sampling. So again, when we do this chapter, I've divided the chapter into 4 parts. The general part, where we will cover what is the meaning of audit sampling and what is the objective of audit sampling as per essay 530. Then what is the scope of our essay, standard on auditing 530. Then what is the requirement of audit sampling? Why do we need to even consider this technique? Then what is the sampling plan? Some basic terms which we will be encountering in this chapter, and we need to know about those terms. Then the second part is sampling approaches. Approaches to use sampling. One is statistical sampling, another is non-statistical sampling. Then we'll compare these two techniques and we'll see their appropriateness, in which situation statistical is favorable and in what situations non-statistical is favorable, as to the appropriateness of these techniques, these approaches as per the situation. Then the third part, sampling risk. And the last and the most detailed part, sampling process. So we'll try to cover the first three parts in our today's session and the fourth part, which is a more detailed part, in our next session. So let's move ahead with our first part, where we'll be talking about some general notions and some general things about sampling. Meaning and objective of audit sampling. Let us first cover what does it mean. So the meaning, the objective, the scope we are covering over here. This is as per standard on auditing. You'll find references to your standard in this chapter wherever we have that coverage. So the whole chapter and essay 530, you'll be covering the whole essay 530 within this chapter. Okay, so no need to worry about that. So let us proceed with the meaning of audit sampling. Okay, so audit sampling refers to the application of audit procedures. What have we done till now? We have done what are our audit procedures? How do we apply on the client's data? So application of audit procedures to less than 100% of items within a population. The whole data, whatever is available to us, the whole situation, the whole file, whatever is available to us for auditing, that is the population. And we extract some part of it, which is less than the 100%. The 100% coverage is the population. And what we extract from it, pick from it, 20%, 30%, 40%, 70%, that is the sample. And we apply our audit procedures on that particularly picked sample. So that is sampling only. Applying audit procedures to less than 100% of items within a population relevant under audit. Such that, so there is the TNC, such that we have applied audit procedures on less than 100% of the items on within the population relevant under audit, such that all sampling units, that is whatever we have chosen from that population, whatever sample of blood has been taken from your veins. So keep this example in mind. Whenever you get a doubt in this chapter, keep that example in mind, that particular example I told you in the previous session. Take any daily routine example from around you, and you will be able to understand the technical concepts better. Such that all the sampling units, that is all the items in the population, have an equal chance of selection. So it says sampling is a technique. It is a method whereby you apply your audit procedures to less than 100% of items within a population, such that all sampling units, that is the all samples which you have chosen, have an equal chance of selection. There is no bias. Any sampling unit can be picked upon to apply the audit procedures. Why is this condition, that they have an equal chance of selection? To ensure that the items selected represent the entire population. They should not be just a glimpse of the population, just an idea of the population. They should be representing the characteristics of the entire population. You see, there are some blood tests where they just prick a pin on your finger, like the test for blood glucose and you're checking your blood group. They just prick a finger, because prick on your finger just to check. That is the only amount of blood required. Just a drop of blood to check the blood sugar levels, to check the blood group. But to check for any infections or deficiencies or any other tests, they take the blood from your veins, because they want to know, they want to be sure that we can test upon it if we require it for the second time, to be assured that yes, this particular deficiency or this particular test result applies to the whole population, and the whole population is the blood running through our veins. So they ensure it that the sample selected represents the entire population. In our case, whatever units we choose, they should have equal chance of getting selected so that they represent the entire population. And as an auditor, I am able to draw conclusions and express my opinion thereon based on a predetermined objective. I have an objective in mind. Keeping that objective in mind, I'll choose the sample. For example, the debtors, the accounts receivable. The client company has 100 major debtors. So, after studying their internal controls, whether they are strong, they are weak, I will develop an objective. I'll determine an objective. Yes, their controls are good. I'll check 50% of the accounts, ledger accounts. I'll verify their balances. I'll vouch the transactions. And if I find that the controls are weak, I might go for 100% checking. Then there will be no audit sampling. I might go for 70% of the accounts to check 70% of the accounts. Based upon the strength of the controls, I would test their internal controls, and based upon the result of those controls, I'll determine my objective of using audit sampling. I'll apply my audit procedures on that particular sample to draw conclusions and thereby expressing my opinion, the task which has been given to me. So this is the meaning of audit sampling. Second, objective. What is the objective of this particular essay? Standard on auditing, which tells us about audit sampling. So standards on auditing are for the help, are the rules which have to be standards, which have to be applied by the auditor while carrying out the audit work. So this particular standard, SA 530, this has an objective to provide a reasonable basis. What is reasonable? Best in the given circumstances, which is not absolute, but best in the given circumstances, logical basis for the auditor to draw conclusions out of his audit procedures. So the audit procedures he applies to draw conclusions out of, as a result of his audit procedures, about the population from which the sample is selected. We get our blood test reports and they tell us, yes, these are the infection levels, these are the red blood cells, and this is the blood sugar level and everything. So the sample derived from the patient, it provides a reasonable basis for the lab person to draw a conclusion about the deficiencies, about the level of infections in our body. and he comes out with the results in the form of a detailed report. In the same way, the auditor derives sample from the population of data which he has to audit. Population of anything, whatever parameters, whatever basis he has been given to audit, the financial statements, the ledger accounts, the account balances, the controls. He'll apply his audit procedures on a sample and he'll draw conclusions about the population from which he has selected the sample and will report accordingly in his audit report. So, meaning and objective of audit sampling. Then what we have, scope. Scope covered under this standard of auditing for the auditor. So, SA 530 becomes applicable only when the auditor has decided to use audit sampling. So, I can come to an inference that it is not mandatory of the auditor to resort to use audit sampling. He can go for 100% detail checking. He can check each and every entry, each and every account, each and every control. There is no bar or limitation upon him that yes, you have to use sampling. You cannot check each and every entry or each and every control or account balance. So it is voluntary on the part of the auditor. But if he chooses to use audit sampling, he has to abide by SA 530. He has to follow SA 530. So, SA 530 becomes applicable when the auditor has decided to use audit sampling in performing his audit procedure. So, this is one of the audit techniques or methods which he can use while carrying out his audit work. And this particular standard deals with the auditor's use of statistical and non-statistical sampling. When does he use the standard? While designing and selecting the audit sample. So, he has to be very clear with the considerations which you need to keep in mind while extracting an audit sample from the population. We'll come to these terms, population, and further in the slides to come. So, the auditor needs to design and select. So, design means he has to set up some criteria, parameters to select the sample, some factors he need to ponder upon. And then selecting on the basis of these factors, selecting the audit sample, performing test of control and test of details. We'll be doing this today. What are test of controls and basically what is test of controls? Test of controls in the organization, internal controls, and test of details is related to the balances, financial transactions at the financial statement level. So while designing and selecting the audit sample, when the audit sample is selecting, then performing audit procedures upon them. And finally, the result of those audit procedures, he will evaluate the results from the sample. Okay. So, blood sample collected, test perform upon it, and report given to the patient. In the same way, auditor designs the criteria, selects the sample, performs tests, and evaluates the results of the audit procedures applied on the sample, and he considers accordingly whether these results corroborate to the population or not. So this is the scope of SA 530. SA 530 tells auditor to cover this. So now there is interplay between SA 500 audit evidence and SA 530. What is that interplay? So as per SA 500, SA 500 is audit evidence which deals with the auditor's responsibility to design and perform audit procedures to obtain sufficient. We have covered already. Sufficient means quantitative, good quantum. And appropriate. Appropriate means relevant, significant. Audit evidence was to draw reasonable conclusions on which his audit opinion will be based. So whenever auditor has an assignment, he has to express his opinion. And that opinion can be expressed on the basis of conclusions, results he has derived by applying his audit procedures on the subject matter which is under audit. It could be controls, it could be anything in the organization, it could be the financial statements. And SA 500 also lays down the means available to the auditor for selecting the items for testing. And one of such means is audit sampling. So auditor can use a variety of ways and methods to obtain such sufficient appropriate audit evidence. SA 500 tells the auditor that you have a variety of ways, means, techniques to collect such sufficient appropriate audit evidence. And one of those means is audit sampling. Hence, SA 530 complements SA 500. So this is the interplay between SA 530 and SA 500. Yes, Pooja, sampling is done by the auditor. Let's move ahead after the scope. Okay. Why does the auditor need, or what is the requirement of using this technique or this method, audit sampling? When we can apply our audit procedures, where we can work upon our audit procedures on the whole data, on all the controls, 100% of audit we can do. Why do we even need it? This particular extra burden on us. Does this extra burden gives us good result, or it is just a burden we voluntarily choose? So let us delve into the reasons. So please read with me. Okay. So it says there is a growing realization that the traditional approach to audit is economically wasteful. Why is it economically wasteful? The traditional approach of checking 100% of the item, 100%, the whole population, because all the efforts are directed to check all transactions, not even leaving a single transaction. All transactions without any exception. We are not leaving even a single entry. We are checking each and every entry, each and every balance, each and every control. Thus, which cannot be covered in 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, 1 week. It requires a lot of time, and thus it leads to more emphasis on routine checking, almost checking on daily basis. And thus huge time and cost gets involved. Cost on the part of the auditor and time also on the part of the auditor. Huge time is involved, that is why huge cost. There is a shift in favor of formal internal controls in the management of affairs of organizations. So, when we look into the past, internal controls used to be weak. Most of the organizations and their management did not pay quite attention to the controls. But with the passage of time, they have come to know, they have been made aware of the importance of strong controls in the organization, and they all have developed a formal internal control policy, and thus the business era, the businesses have shifted from a conventional internal control framework to a more formal framework, due to which the possibilities of routine errors and frauds have greatly diminished. So there used to be an accountant was passing 100 entries in the past, and almost 80 to 70 to 80 entries would need to be revised or rechecked. But with the use of automated accounting softwares, with the use of more skilled personnel and employees, good controls, maker checker controls and everything, which have been put into place by the management for the prevention, detection, and correction of frauds. The first requirement would be to prevent the fraud. The first thing is mind would be to prevent it, to let it not happen. But if it has happened or occurred, to detect it. This is a big challenge again. If we were not able to prevent it, internal controls have been strengthened, policies framed, which has led to and led the errors, the frauds to occur less in the organization. They are being prevented, detected, and corrected in a timely manner. So, with such appropriate controls in place, the auditors find this routine checking as nothing more than a ritual or a convention or a mechanical work. And when something gets monotonous, repeated, without any results, it gives boredom. It doesn't yield results. And they don't find anything material. Further, more attention is required to the question of principles, that is, the working in the organization and controls of the organization. So, more attention is required towards this. And we need to curtail the conventional, non-consequential routine checking. Non-consequential means is not yielding results. This particular routine checking is not yielding any results for us. Because by routine checking, we mean 100% checking, extensive checking, and vouching of all the entries. We do not consider the concept of materiality. We have covered materiality in chapter 2. What are material items? What is materiality? What is materiality level? What is performance materiality? We do not even consider those. We just don't consider materiality. It is of no importance to us. We are going to check each and every transaction, each and every balance. So materiality finds no relevance in our audit in that case. The extent of checking further is a matter of judgment of the auditor, and there is no statutory liability anywhere which states that what work is to be done by the auditor, how it is to be done, and to what extent it has to be done. It is also not obligatory, mandatory on the part of the auditor that he must definitely adopt the sampling technique. So this technique is just an aid for the auditor. It is not required of him to definitely certainly use this technique, the sampling technique. Voluntary on the auditor's part. What is required of him statutorily, legally is that he has to express his opinion on the financial statements. And he becomes bound by that opinion. What he expresses, he becomes bound by that because he has conducted the audit. Whether he checked 100% of the transactions, 80%, 90%, 70, 10, 20 is completely upon the auditor. He can use sampling to any level keeping in mind the risks associated of using this technique and the resulting effects. To ensure a good and reasonable standard of work, the auditor has to adopt standards on auditing, and techniques that can lead him to an informed professional opinion. What is informed professional opinion? Opinion given by a professional in a well-informed situation. So it is in the interest of the auditor if he decides to form his opinion on the basis of part checking. Part checking means he's not checked 100% of the population. If he is resorting to the use of sampling, he's not doing routine extensive checking, so there could be a little bit of the risk. So to mitigate this risk, if he is using sampling, it is obligatory on his part to adopt standards and techniques which are widely followed, and they have some ground, they have some foundation, they have a recognition. Whatever standards and techniques he is using is not using any haphazard or random technique. It should be logical, scientific, and having a ground, a recognizable basis. Now, in most of the circumstances, the evidence available is not conclusive. What do we mean by conclusive evidence? I want answers from you people. It says in most of the circumstances, the evidence available is not conclusive. So what is conclusive evidence? Yes, please. What evidence is conclusive? You might have read about it in your corporate law as well. Conclusive evidence. So what is conclusive? That auditor always takes a calculated risk in giving his opinion. So I'm not receiving any of the answers. Do I also need to refresh my web page again? Yes, Harsh says it will not be a guarantee. Good. Reliable and relevant. No, we don't get any conclusion. Conclusive means we are not. Yes, someone said, Harsh said guarantee accordingly. So it is not conclusive. We have not reached a conclusion. We are not concluding the fact. We call it in Hindi patthar ki laki. We are not coming to a conclusion. So this particular evidence, in most of the circumstances, the audit evidence available is not conclusive. Not conclusive means which does not lead us to the end, to a proper result, final result. It is just a directional evidence. It does not conclude the part. And the auditor therefore always takes a calculated risk because it is not conclusive. The auditor takes a calculated risk. Calculated risk is auditor keeping in mind all the calculations if he can bear with that risk. Even by undertaking 100% checking of the transactions, the auditor doesn't derive absolute satisfaction. So we have absolute and conclusive. Even after checking 100%, it doesn't get concluding satisfaction or absolute satisfaction. Absolute means in whole terms. So, opposite of conclusive is reasonable. So, auditor gets reasonable evidence, reasonable satisfaction, not conclusive, that he can vouch upon the result. He can take guarantee. He can never. By adopting the sampling technique, the auditor only checks a part of the whole mass of the transactions. The satisfaction he used to derive earlier by checking all the transactions can be derived by sample checking, provided he can put reliance on the internal controls. Again, we'll read further what design, what quantum of sample, how many samples he need to take out of the population to apply his audit procedures certainly depends upon the reliance he can place on the internal controls. So, sampling is also used as a part of test of controls. So, auditor will check few internal controls, will not check all the internal controls. He'll check a few internal controls and their operating effectiveness. And based on the conclusion derived, he can design the sample size for test of details, that is checking of transactions and balances. So there is test of controls and test of details. The first step the auditor will do is he'll check controls. He'll test the controls, and in testing those controls as well, he'll use sampling. In our school days, when our teacher used to check her test copies, what he or she will do? He'll see first question wrong, second question wrong, third. He'll just look at you. Everything is wrong. I don't have any hopes that further anything would be right. So auditor checks few controls. He tests their operating effectiveness. And based on the results of those tests of controls, he'll decide the second step. What efforts do I have to make while checking the transactions and balances now? If the controls are good, he will be easily making out samples, extracting samples from the population. Okay, the controls are really good, so I need not check everything in detail. I'll need to check the important, the significant, the material parts. But if he finds that the controls are weak, his burden increases, and he comes to a conclusion that his sample should cover most of the population because the controls seem to be weak. So it gives us in detail further. If the internal control is satisfactory in its design and implementation, the organization would have designed the internal controls, the biometrics, the access security, the network operation. We have done in the previous chapter, general IT controls, application controls, IT dependent controls are the controls in an automated environment. And whatever the other internal controls are, you have covered that in chapter 4. So if the controls are satisfactory in design, as per the entity's business, organization's business, nature of industry, if the auditor feels that the controls are satisfactory in design and are being implemented well, by the organization, he can go for a much smaller sample selection, because that smaller sample can give the auditor necessary reliability, trust upon the results he obtained. But if certain areas controls are slack or not properly implemented, Slack means weak or missing. But, or if the controls are there, but they are not being properly implemented in the organization, the auditor may have to make much larger sample for getting satisfactory results. The first step for the auditor would be to check the controls. On the basis of the test of controls, the auditor would decide further how to check the test of details, how to test the details. That is checking of transactions and balances. So you can apply the sampling technique at controls part first. On the basis of the result of test of controls, he can decide upon the design and size of the sample. For the further, the important part is test of details. So that is what, why does an auditor need the method, the technique of audit sampling? So in the sampling process, the auditor needs to plan. The auditor needs to plan, right? And if he wants to choose, he wants to resort to using audit sampling technique, the auditor has to plan about that as well. We have done strategy, planning, and program. So while planning, he has to craft a sampling plan as well. What samples, out of which areas of the population here means the controls, all the controls or the data, the details, the controls under audit. So he has to make a sampling plan as well. What do I need to check? How do I need to make the sample? What should be the size of the sample? How many sampling units do I need to pick? And if he is using sampling, SA 530 would come into force as well. So to develop a sampling plan, the auditor needs to consider certain factors. So the factors that he should be considering for deciding upon the extent of checking on the sample. What are the factors that the auditor needs to consider while developing a sampling plan? Size of the organization under audit. If we are auditing a sole proprietor or a company with quite a low turnover, anything could be the criteria. The size of it is a small organization, medium scale organization, very big organization. It will affect what kind of sampling plan you prepare. What would be the size of your sample? What would be the frequency, the number of your samples? The size of the organization under audit. If it is a small organization, I'll say, why to derive some sample from it? Why can't I go for 100% checking? It will take a day or two. I'll first take 1 day or half a day to make a sampling plan. Then I'll ask my team to study that sampling plan. I'll make them aware of how to make the samples and how to apply those audit procedures. And that much of time, as per keeping the size of the organization in mind, I can get 100% checking done. My engagement team can resort to 100% checking in that much available time. So why would I need to go for sampling, to use sampling? But if it is a big organization, I would definitely want to use the technique of audit sampling. Because if I go for 100% checking, it will consume a lot of time. The size of the organization under audit is an important factor. Then the state of internal controls we have already covered. Controls are weak, so you cannot go for much sampling. If controls are really good, audit sampling is going to prove a boon for you if the controls are really good. Then adequacy and reliability of books and records. Adequacy is how much adequate, in good state, the documents you require for audit, the books of account are available to you. Are there any missing books or ledgers or documents? Or you have been provided with the whole set, complete set. That is adequacy or inadequacy. Whatever is required by us, is it available to us, or there is some deficiency? Some documents or books are missing. Then it would be inadequate. Otherwise, if you are given the complete set, we are provided each and everything we want of the client organization, that is called adequacy. So adequacy and reliability. So whether you can rely upon the books of accounts given to you, again, that is a matter of professional judgment. By just going through the books of account, you can come to a conclusion whether you can rely, whether the accounts are neat and clean, whether the controls are good. So adequacy and reliability of books and records is also an important factor while deciding upon a sampling plan. Tolerable error range is very important. What is tolerable error range? As an auditor, I define an error range. So deviations or errors, I'll define a range, 2 to 5% of change. I'll define it as a tolerable error. Tolerable error means the error in the books of account or the controls which the auditor feels is normal, common. You cannot just avoid it. The client organizations cannot just avoid it, and it is assumed by the auditor that these are the common errors which we are going to find in every kind of organization. Usually, whether the controls are good, bad, weak. So in the case of weak controls, the auditor will definitely be wanting to decide upon a tolerable error range. That yes, this is my level, tolerable level. For example, the auditor is checking for the sales book, right? The client team is checking the sales ledger or the sales book and finds that out of 1,000 of the invoices, if 2 or 3 of the invoices in the sales ledger or sales book or sales file are missing, it is okay, it is fine, it is normal. Sometimes the 2 or 3 invoices of very, I would say, negligible values, 5,000, 10,000, which are not that material. Auditor would say, yes, this is kind of tolerable. He'll develop a tolerable error range. From this to this, it is completely fine. My audit is not going to be affected by this, provided there are alternative ways to check for those particular errors. Compensating controls we did in the last session. If there are alternative means to check for those, to vouch for those transactions, I would say it's completely fine. 2 or 3 invoices are missing, no issue. But if 10, 15, 20 invoices are missing, they would exceed his tolerable error range. This is out of my scope, out of my patience level, tolerance level. What is the deal with the client company? Where are their invoices going? Why are they missing? 2 or 3 is a common general problem. It is completely fine. But 15, 20, who is maintaining the file? Why such an irresponsible behavior? How do I vouch for the sales transaction entered into the system if I cannot corroborate it, compare it with the invoices available? So I'll say the books of accounts or the documents available to me are inadequate. And finally, the degree of desired confidence. After going through the controls, testing the controls, going through the books and records of the organization, what degree of confidence he has developed and he feels that yes, I can place my so much of confidence in the client's work. So these are the factors which are very important while devising a sampling plan. Size of the organization under audit, state of the internal control, adequacy and reliability of books and records, tolerable error range, degree of the desired confidence. Further, sampling can never bring complete reliability, but obvious. We've read even 100% checking cannot give us the desired confidence. How can sampling be completely reliable? It cannot give precisely accurate results. Sampling can give accurate results, but not precise accurate results. You cannot say 100%. It might be 100% good. It might not be. There can be an error of 2 to 3%, 5%. Because sampling is just a process of estimation. Sometimes when we get our blood tested from one of the laboratories, the doctor asks us to get a second opinion, get the test done from another lab as well, to vouch for the results, whether you are carrying this particular infection in your blood or not. What is the level of that infection? So standing is basically a process of estimation, and it may have some error. What error is tolerable for a particular matter is a matter of the individual's judgment. So in our case, tolerable error is a matter of auditor's judgment, professional judgment. It is not written anywhere in the statutory provisions or legal provisions. Yes, this much amount is the tolerable to be taken by every auditor. Based upon the personal judgment, personal experience, and the desired level of confidence of the auditor, he'll establish what error is tolerable for him for a particular matter under his examination. So it will differ from auditor to auditor, person to person, client to client as well. It might differ within the engagement team as well. Because professional judgment is a result of experience, professional experience. More the experience you have, more good your professional judgments are. For example, there is an example. Mr. X is an auditor. He may consider that his estimation of stores valuation of the stock stores, an error of 2% may not be material. So at least 98% reliability, I'm okay with it. An error of 2%, he has defined it as tolerable error. If they have valued the stock at rupees 100 per item, and as per my valuation, it comes around 98, 99, it is completely fine. But below that, I won't tolerate the error in valuation. 98% reliability I'm getting, it is fine. I have no troubles with that. So the auditor, Mr. X, has defined his tolerable level. He is to pick up the requisite number of items of the stores for reliability of the result. So if you have done operations research or random number tables in your probability chapter, you'll use the random number table. It is a technique, mathematical technique to derive sample. So we'll derive sample for the valuation of stores, different kind of stores in the organization stock. We'll use the random number table to check for the reliability of the result. It is directly linked. The reliability is directly linked with the reliability of internal control and of the books and records. But obvious, these were our initial steps. We had whether we are relying upon the internal controls or not. After checking the internal controls, after testing the internal controls, and definitely the books and records, whether they are adequate and reliable or not. So if the internal controls are reliable, the books and records are adequate and reliable, I won't choose many of the items. But if I found any deficiency in the controls or the books and records, my sample size would increase. I'll choose more number of items and apply my audit procedures on those items to see if valuation of any of the items exceeds the error range of my tolerable error. So if the reliance is satisfactory, right? Lesser degree of reliability of the sampling estimation. If not satisfactory, the auditor may have to decide upon a higher degree of reliability, which can only be obtained from a larger sample. If I feel that the controls are reliable, the books and records are reliable, so I won't require much reliability from the sample reliability. Lesser degree of reliability, marginal utility. You know the law of diminishing marginal utility. Yeah? Internal controls reliable, books and controls reliable. So even if lesser degree of reliability I can obtain from the sampling, I'll be satisfied. But if I'm not satisfied with the internal controls and books and records, I'm not able to achieve the level of reliability, trust, to trust on the controls maintained in the organization, implemented in the organization, or the books and records made available to me, I might decide, no, I won't take more risks further. I'll go for a larger sample selection, will apply my audit procedures, and will try to obtain a higher degree of reliability at this stage. If I have not obtained a higher degree of reliability in the previous steps of controls, checking controls, and books and balances. Yes, Pooja, completely correct. So the auditor will test the internal controls, the further test of controls, then the test of details, transactions, and then he'll decide whether what kind of sampling he needs to use. The train of trust is running through every platform. The first platform was the test of controls. It reached there in time, means the auditor is satisfactory with respect to the controls. Further, the second station was books and records. The auditor is satisfactory. Reliability. Yes, books and records are good. Now the third station is sampling. Whether he needs to apply his audit procedures on 100% of the population or a sample derived from the population. So if he has obtained good reliability in the previous two stations, previous two steps, he'll be okay with lesser reliability over here. He'll not do much work over here. But if your train was late at the previous two stations as well, it is but obvious that you'll feel it will be arriving late at the next station as well. Same thing applies over here. If the controls were weak, the books and records were not adequate, you could not establish any reliability over there. Now, at this stage, you will be hungry for more reliability, for more trust, and you will be resorting to sampling at a huge level. A larger sample you will be selecting, more population, more part of the population you would be covering, so that at least at this level, your marginal utility is satisfied. You get higher reliability and higher satisfaction. Okay, so let us come to some term. Any doubt till now, please? So that we'll come to the terms population, sample, and other terms, please. Any doubt till now? I'm not able to understand, Mr. Nathani, Jamil Nathani. What have you written? Further audit procedure. What do you want to convey or ask? Yes, Pooja. You happen to use such daily routine like examples from around you. You'll understand the technical concepts better. I'm a kind of person who likes train traveling more than the flights and the road transport traveling. So I'll relate it to that thing which I like the most. So it is just a tip for you people. Whenever you're doing a technical subject like audit, EIS, SM, so if you are not able to understand or grasp the concept really well, just relate it to anything usual around you, which you like. You'll understand the concept really well. Fine. So let's move ahead to certain terms. So the first term is population. Oh, yes, we have read about it in economics. Demographic, population, right? And in terms of audit, population is with respect to the data, the accounting data, the financial data, which we are auditing as an auditor. So here you can see in this image, I've shown some population, right? Let us relate it to population. Many people standing over here, men, women, right? And over here, what have I done? They were all standing in a circle and I separated some of them. So what is it? This is a sample. This is a sample. Yes, Jamil, you're right. So this is a sample. Suppose you order this. Doesn't it look like a pizza? It looks like a pizza, right? Or you call it a pie chart or anything, whatever you like. So I've ordered a pizza or I've made it at home, prepared it at home. So I'll taste it. I'll check for it whether all the masalas, spices, and the veggies, cheese, everything is good. So I can have the whole. So I'll take a piece out. I'll check whether the oregano is good, the flakes and everything. Whether there is, I require anything more. I need to put in more oregano or sauces or cheese or flakes. I won't eat the whole pizza and then I'll say, oh, I needed more flakes or oregano or something like that. I'll just use one piece, I'll taste it, and for the rest of the pizza, I would make it as per my taste. So you have done sampling. You just tasted a bite, one piece, and you customize the whole pizza as per your preference. In the same manner, the whole pizza was a population, and a piece you had taken out of that population was your sample. You carried out a test on it by tasting it, and you made changes to the whole population on the basis of this test, right? So this is what sampling basically is. So out of this whole population, we separated some people and asked them certain questions. So we separated them, and suppose it is an election survey. So we need to know about the preferences, or there is a company which wants to set up a business in a particular area. It has lots of funds, but it is not able to decide in which particular segment it should open its business or invest its money. So it will carry out a survey in that particular locality, but it will not go door to door. Okay, what do you like? Would you like to have? Which kind of factory? What kind of operating unit would you like to have over here? What is your requirement in this particular area or a remote area? They'll just survey some of the persons. So this is the time of elections in India, in many states. So you will be watching news, the surveys and all. They tell you about the surveys, what are the results of their surveys. So do they ask each and every voter whom you are going to vote? No. They'll just design a sample, will be interviewing some people from different segments of the society, will interview them, will ask them questions, and then we'll club all the answers, and then we'll come out with the results of our survey. And we have seen it in the past. The results of the surveys are sometimes quite accurate and sometimes they are completely opposite. Sampling estimation. So this is how the auditor also makes sampling the base of his opinion. So population refers to the entire set of data from which a sample is selected and about which the auditor wishes to draw conclusions. Here this which has been used for population. So the auditor has been given a population, the entire set of data. The auditor has to audit that data and come out with the conclusion and frame his opinion. So auditor says, won't check the entire data. I'll select a sample, and this particular chapter is about that sampling only, to help the auditor how he needs to design a sample, what plan he needs to make, what procedures he needs to apply on the sample, what would be his results, how do he need to evaluate his results, what would be the process, and how does he need to document and report the results of the samples. So it is that entire set of data for which the auditor wishes to draw conclusions by selecting samples and performing his audit procedures thereupon. The auditor should select samples in such a way that the sample can be expected to be representative of the population. So this requires all the items in the population have the opportunity of being selected. This is very important. So the population should be such uniform. Uniformity in population is a prerequisite for sampling. If your population is not uniform or homogeneous, sampling will not give precise results or accurate results. Uniformity or homogeneity means having the same characteristics. So the samples should be selected in such a manner that they represent the whole population. And every unit, all items in the population have an opportunity of being selected. Take the example of sundry payables. You are scrutinizing the ledgers of your client, and take the example of sundry payables. See, you cannot just select any 3 or 4 creditors and base an opinion about the creditors. There is quite a possibility that you by chance, by incidentally, you take the sample of only those 3 creditors whose accounts are doing really good. You will frame an opinion, you'll come with the conclusion, yes, there is no problem with the sundry payables. The money is being received in time. There are 30 accounts, you chose only those 3 accounts incidentally, accidentally, which were doing good. But there were 20 such accounts which you didn't check, where there was lag in payment, the operating cycle was getting disturbed, the client company or the managers were not making efforts to collect the money, or there were some MSME, to pay the money, or there were some MSME creditors where the law has given extra protection and you need to, when you are auditing as per the income tax law, you have a specific point over there that MSME creditors, whether you are paying them regularly or not. You checked just 3 accounts, you said yes, MSME creditors are being paid good, just on the basis of sample you draw. So a sample should be such that it should be representing the whole population. Every kind of account should have a proper opportunity of getting selected. This is what population is. Then the characteristics of population. Population, the data given to you, what should be the characteristics of that particular auditing population? The first characteristic is appropriateness. The population should be appropriate. Appropriate means relevant. So the auditor needs to determine that the population from which the sample has been drawn by him is appropriate for the specific audit objective. What does appropriate mean? You have a specific audit objective in mind. You are testing the operating effectiveness of physical controls. So you will derive sample, you will select such controls where you can check their operating effectiveness physically. They should be appropriate. You will not sit on one desktop and you'll see, yes, the security guard was coming in time and the security policy says this, and the CCTV cameras are working, this report says this. You are applying your audit procedures on a population of the data in a desktop, but you were given the task of physically checking all this. You'll have to check. If there are 100 CCTV cameras in the building, you can draw a sample of 25 cameras that I'll be checking on first floor, third floor, and you need not tell the client about this. You check anywhere. Your sample should be completely corroborative of the population. So your audit objective was to check for the physical access and working of the cameras, for example. Or you can go to the server room where you have access to the screen of all the cameras, and you find that 3 or 4 cameras have blackout screens on second floor. You'll go on the second floor of the organization and you'll check all the cameras over there. So you had a specific objective in mind. So your sample should be drawn appropriately for that particular specific objective. Okay, so appropriate means population from which the samples are drawn shall be relevant for the specific objective under audit. This is because when the samples are drawn, the audit procedure are applied on the sample and the conclusions are projected on the population. So whatever results we obtain from the sample, we project it on the whole population. We assume it to be true for the whole population. Take another daily routine example. I talked about blood tests. So there are different kind of tests as well. When someone is ill, the patient goes through a lot of tests, blood tests, urine tests. So there are some tests, there are some tests which can be carried out only on the waste from your body, which can tell us more about your physical state by if the lab person checks and carries out tests on the waste from the body rather than blood. So what is appropriate over here? Appropriate population over here is the human body waste, where the lab person can apply his lab tests rather than blood. But if we go and just give our blood sample, will it do us the work? No. That is why the doctors prescribe the patients, no, don't go for the blood test this time. I need to see a report of your urine test. I need to know what kind of infection is there, and that can be understood from that particular test only. So in this case, the appropriate population is not the blood, but the body waste. In the same manner, in auditing as well, our population should be relevant from which we are extracting the sample and working upon it, because the results which we will be getting from the sample will be projecting it upon the whole population. So it is very much important for the auditor to ensure that the population is appropriate to the objective of the audit procedure, and it will be considered the direction of testing. Here we have an example. If relating to our field, if the auditor's objective were to test for overstatement of accounts receivable, the client company shows that our accounts receivable are 3 crores, and the auditor feels that they have been overstated. The debtors balances are not that much, because the client company wants, the organization wants to show good asset position. See, we have so much of receivables. We can recover from them anytime. Current assets. So if the auditor feels that the debtors, the accounts receivables have been overstated, overvalued, whatever they actually are, if there are 2.90 crores, they are inflated, overstated by 10 lakhs to 3 crores. So the auditor would check the accounts receivables. For that particular purpose, he'll derive his samples from account receivable. In this case, the population would be account receivables listing. If the auditor has doubt regarding accounts payable, the sundry creditors and other payables, that they are understated. Understated means the organization, the client entity has the liability of 5 crores towards the market, but it is shown in its balance sheet of 4 crores. I feel they are somewhere understated. When I've checked the books and records, I feel they are understated, just to show a good financial position. So in this case, take care. In the case of overstatement of accounts receivable, I check the account receivables listing. But in the case of understatement of accounts payable, my population would not be accounts payable. My population would be disbursements, payments made to them. If there are any unpaid invoices, I'll check for them. Supplier statements, which I get on a periodical basis. unmatched receiving reports, the material received, the payments received, the payments given. So these are the kinds of accounts which would become a part of my population, which would form my population, rather than accounts payable listing. This will not be a part of my population. This is how you need to understand what is appropriate population. The population needs to be complete. The second part is completeness, which means that if the auditor intends to use the sample to draw conclusions about whether a control activity is operated effectively during the financial reporting period, the population needs to include all relevant items. That is, all the activities that form part of that relevant internal control throughout the entire period. Take the example of CCTV cameras. I told you that I want to check the CCTV cameras. I've been given, yes, sir, first floor, second floor, third floor, but yes, you cannot go to the fourth floor. Why can't I go to the fourth floor? I have to check, I have to report in my audit report as per the task given to me that I have to check for the working of CCTV cameras as well. Why can't I go to the fourth floor? Sorry, sir, there is a limitation. You cannot go to the fourth floor. My population is incomplete. I wanted to derive samples. I wanted to check 4 to 5 CCTV cameras at every floor. But I couldn't check on the fourth floor. I had to derive my sample from the CCTV cameras on 3 floors only. So I wanted to check the control activity. What was the control activity? Working of the CCTV cameras. Whether all the CCTV cameras are operating effectively or not. So the population required to include all the CCTV cameras, but I was restricted. There was a limitation placed on my working that you cannot go to the fourth floor. It is not accessible. My population was not complete. My sample was incomplete. So I would write in my audit report, my population was appropriate, relevant, but it was not complete. So only if population is complete in all respects, the conclusions drawn on the population will be considered reliable, that yes, the sample is a representative of the population. Now my population, the third part, it should be reliable. I should be able to place my reliability on the population. So auditor has to develop confidence that the information selected in the sample on which the audit sampling is being performed is complete and accurate in a sufficient manner. Whatever quantum is required by the auditor, the sampling and the population is complete and accurate in that particular respect. If I'm auditing the accounts receivable of the company and the accountant says, sir, I need to make certain adjustments owing to certain invoices received just recently. Certain invoices were missing. Certain payments were not given effect to in the accounts. I have to make certain adjustments. I'll make the adjustments and then only I can audit your accounts, your data. I cannot audit it right now because the population is not complete and I cannot rely upon your accounting data. Because to rely upon your data, it has to be complete and accurate. It is not giving a true and fair view right now. It is incomplete and therefore I cannot rely upon it. Unless and until you can rely upon the population, you cannot use the technique of audit sampling. The auditor should obtain evidence about the reliability of the population. If the population is not reliable with respect to accuracy and source, sample drawn is irrelevant for our specific audit objective. The accountant says, sir, I have made entries in the data from a notebook maintained by the accounts head or the salesman. I haven't compared and cross-tallied it with the invoices. What should I audit them? The population is not reliable. Population in our case is the data. It is not reliable because the source of the population is not okay. The source was not complete. Any cross-telling work was still required to much cross-telling work was still required to be done at the accountant's end. My sample would be ineffective. So my population needs to be appropriate, complete, and reliable. Yes, audit sampling is a process, Tanu. Okay. Any doubts regarding what is population and characteristics of population? Yes, Rupesh, Mr. Bhimani, definitely you can use examples by quoting company law. Why not? Practical example, definitely you can use. You can quote examples, but they should be accurate, right? हवा में नहीं होनी चाहिए. So before moving ahead, we'll take a break. If any doubts till now, just put in your queries. So we break for yes, Pooja. These all characteristics are required to be present simultaneously. The population should be appropriate, complete, and reliable at the same time. Even one of them is missing, the sample would not work. The population will not give, the sample derived from such population will not give good results. So we break for 15 minutes and we'll be back at 7:45. Okay, we are back after the break. So after reading about population, let's move to our next term. Sampling unit. Very easy. The sample we select from the population is sampling unit. No. Actually, the units of all the population which are subject to sampling. The units comprising the population which would be subject to sampling, not the selected ones. Before selection, the units of the population on which the sampling process would be carried out. Further, audit procedures would be carried out on the chosen ones. So, the individual items that make up the population are known as sampling units. So, you can divide the population in a variety of ways. Interpolation, extrapolation is a statistical term. You might have done this exercise. Take the example of a class. You divide the class into four on the basis of streams: medical, non-medical, commerce, arts. You want a sample. You want to select some students from the science field. So commerce and arts are irrelevant for you. What would be your sampling units? The medical and the non-medical streams. Now you will select students from those two streams and send them or give them the desired work. All the streams can be further divided on the basis of gender, boys and girls, third gender. Okay. You can make sampling units on the basis of that as well, or on the basis of city, on the basis of preferences. So all the units, the students are the units, right? So in the same manner in auditing, from the data, all the units which make up the population are known as sampling units, on which we can carry out the process of sampling, and further we take samples out of the population on which we carry out our audit procedures. So audit procedures are applied on the chosen units and conclusions are drawn from them to be projected on the whole population. Conclusions drawn on the sample become the conclusion of the population from where it is drawn. The example of blood test. The test results give us the conclusion that the blood flowing through the veins of our body. What is it deficient in? What are the infections and all? And the sample must be large enough to provide statistically meaningful results. I told you, for checking the blood sugar level or the blood group level, they just prick your finger, 4 drops of blood enough for their subject matter. But if we want to go for checking of the infections and other parameters in your blood, they extract more blood out of your veins. They don't take it from the finger then, okay? They take it from the veins, from your arm. So the sample must be in that much of quantity or number so that you can derive statistically meaningful results. This happens in the case of our auditing as well. So if there is a list of 100 debtors and you are checking only 10 debtors, it is not large enough. You can decide to check at least 75, 60, 80% of the debtors. We have an example with us. If auditors wants to test the validity of accounts receivables, sundry debtors, the sampling unit could be defined as the customer balances or individual customer invoices. Auditor defines sampling unit in order to obtain an efficient and effective sample. Efficient sample means a sample which bears the characteristics of the population. It is a true representative of the population, then only it is an efficient sample on which we can carry out our audit procedures. An effective sample, it would be when the results we get from this sample, we can project it on the entire population. Only then our particular audit objectives are achieved. So, very well said. The conclusion on the population is based on the audit procedures applied on the sampling unit. Now some other terms. The first term is stratification. What is stratification? It is a process of dividing a population into subpopulations. So categorizing, subcategorizing. Subcategorizing the population, each of which is a group of sampling units which have similar characteristics. In our case, it is often monetary value. In the case of auditing, we stratify basically on the basis of monetary value. But let us take an example. You can see on the right, there is machine-wise stratification. We have machine 1, machine 2, machine 3. Yes, Pooja. So we have machine 1, machine 2, machine 3. We have their graphs with respect to the defected quantity they produce on respective dates. So there was this population of plant and machinery block in a factory. We divided it into the machines. We could subcategorize it into subpopulations. These are the machines which work on power, and these are the machines which work with manual labor. Done. These are the machines which are newly purchased. These are the machines which are second hand. These are heavy machines. These are the lighter machines. So each category's sampling units would be the same. If I take up the machine group which works with the power, then they have a common trait. All the units in that particular group would be working with power, with the aid of power. That is their common characteristic. So I take up that subgroup from the population. And I want to analyze the data that during the last week, during the last 6 days, so the machines which were working with the aid of power, there were certain cuts, electricity cuts. We were working with generators. And what effect has it made on the working and results, efficiency and effectiveness of those machines? So this is a graph for machine 1, graph for machine 2, graph for machine 3, the number of defected quantity pieces they produced. Or take another sampling unit, subpopulation. The population remains the same. We are just dividing it, categorizing it in a different manner on the basis of a common criteria, subpopulation, from where we'll be deriving samples. Now, this was a machine which was a group which was working with the aid of power. There is another group, another kind of machines which are working without the aid of power, manual intervention. So I need to check the efficiency of the workers working on those machines. So now machine 1, machine 2, machine 3 from that particular category, this could be their efficiency. I want to have a word with the workers. Why is machine 3 producing large number of defective goods? I would have a word with the workers working on that machine? Is there a problem with the efficiency or with the working of the machine itself? We need to replace that machine, buy a new machine, or it needs overhauling or repairs. So it is just subcategorizing the population further, and we derive sampling units from each subcategory having similar characteristics. That is called stratification, and we have stratification in detail in our next session as well. Tolerable misstatement, again, tolerable error, tolerable misstatement, the misstatement which the auditor has set to a level that it is tolerable at my end. The auditor is like, ये दुख मैं सह लूंगा, ये misstatement, this misstatement. So a monetary amount, again, we are talking in monetary terms, satisfaction, tolerable misstatement, a monetary amount set by the auditor in respect of which the auditor seeks to obtain an appropriate level of assurance that the monetary amount set by the auditor is not exceeded by the actual mistreatment in the population. The auditor has set a bar that if a misstatement is above this level, I will not be able to tolerate that. I'll have to I'll be requiring to have a word with the management or those charged with those charged with governance. So that is the level set by the auditor, tolerable mistreatment. What is tolerable rate of deviation? A rate of deviation from prescribed internal control procedures set by the auditor in respect of which the auditor seeks to obtain an appropriate level of assurance that the rate of deviation set by the auditor is not exceeded by the actual rate of deviation. The auditor says, I want to see the attendance register of the security guard. I've set a tolerable level to 3 absences during important events happening at the factory gate. The important event could be entry of different persons, delivery of goods, major goods. So I go through the attendance register, that is an internal control, and I check that the security guard was on leave for 5 days and there was no alternative security guard posted at the factory gate beyond my tolerable rate of deviation. Misstatements you would be finding in the level of test of details and rate of deviation in the case of internal control procedures. So I have set up that there could be only 2 such instances that would be within my tolerable range, rate of deviation. That if the security guards were not there at 2 such important events, it is fine. So I found through the attendance register or the log that security guard was absent for 1 day, and for other days when he was absent, another security guard was posted at his place alternatively till the first one resumed his duty. So this is within my tolerable rate of deviation, within my tolerable range. So stratification, tolerable misstatement, tolerable rate of deviation. It is completely fine, Charu, if you didn't get the example. Just remember, stratification, we'll be covering it on our next session as well. Stratification is dividing a population into subpopulation based upon similar characteristics, right? So each subpopulation will have sampling units, will combine of sampling units which will have similar characteristics. In our case, in auditing, the parameter, the criteria is usually monetary value, terms of money. Okay, let's move ahead. Okay, approaches to sampling, very interesting. Approaches to sampling. If you have taken maths in +1, +2, or statistics in your graduation, you might have done, or in ninth or 10th standard as well, we do uh, practice this chapter, probability. We are made to read this chapter, practice this chapter, probability. Statistical sampling, the name itself suggests. So here we are approaches to sampling. How do we resort to using sampling? What approach do we use? How do we choose the sample? In a statistical manner or a non-statistical manner? So first we have statistical sampling. What does it mean? Statistical, as the name suggests, using some mathematical or statistical methods, probabilities, random number tables, or you might have done Monte Carlo simulation, something like that, where you use some mathematical base, some mathematical logic. Sampling, where the sample is chosen by applying certain mathematical and statistical methods. You can see in this picture on the right, a certain technique is applied. In this case, 1/4 of the sample has been chosen. In this case, half of the population has been divided into two parts, right? And in this case, this much percentage. So there were some statistical techniques or mathematical formulas or any process used to derive a sample out of the population. Now the features of this kind of sampling: an approach to sampling that has a random selection of the sample items. The selection is random, but this random selection is based upon some mathematical technique. We use the probability theory to evaluate sample results, and the use of probability theory including measurement of sampling risk characteristics. We'll come to what is sampling risk. So when we use a mathematical or statistical technique in sampling, it is called statistical sampling. What is non-statistical sampling? Where sample is chosen on any arbitrary basis as per the personal experience and knowledge of the auditor, where we do not confine ourselves to any mathematical or scientific logic. That is non-statistical sampling. What is non-statistical sampling? The sampling which is not statistical is non-statistical sampling. What are the features of this kind of sampling? So auditor, on the basis of his personal experience, will determine the size of the sample and express it in terms that number of pages or personal accounts in the purchase or sales ledger to be checked. The last time I audited the accounts of this entity, I found a lot of purchase invoices were missing, and many of the sales invoices were not telling with what was fed into the system. My sample size would definitely be large. I won't go for any mathematical or statistical formula to derive sample. I'll say my sample would be large, and I'll be concentrating more on big value purchases or sales. I'm auditing the accounts of this particular entity for the first time. It belongs to the hospitality industry. For example, it is um, a hospital. The last time I audited the accounts of another hospital, I found a peculiar issue. What was that issue? So the machines were being purchased out of the country but their value in foreign currency was not accounted for. So in this case, I won't derive samples on the machines. I'll take out all the machines which have been purchased from outside the country. I won't make samples out of that. Based upon my previous experience with the same client or any other client, and as per my professional judgment, I'm deciding upon the size of the sample and my audit procedures. I'm not resorting to any mathematical or statistical techniques. That is non-statistical sampling. For example, to check the sales ledger or purchase invoices, in 1 year we select March, June, and September. And different months we are selecting in another year. Top 10 highest value items we are selecting. That is not a mathematical formula. That is just randomly. Just give me the copy of accounts of top 10 highest value vendors or your suppliers or your customers. So we just establish a trend. We try to fit in a trend. An attempt would be made to avoid establishing a pattern. So the trend we are trying to fit in, it goes on changing every year. It should not be the same. So it says it should avoid establishing a pattern, the same trend of selection year after year. That is the way of selecting samples to maintain an element of surprise. So what is the auditor is going to check? Last time I came over here, I told them, just give me the copy of accounts of your customers from the northern region. The next time I am coming to audit their accounts, they'll be keeping the northern region intact. All the accounts, copy of accounts properly maintained, every entry passed in, every invoice tallied. Now I come and tell them, no, 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 no. I don't want to check north this time. I want to check west. So there should be an element of surprise. If I use a mathematical technique, the client would come to know about it at some point of time and he'll be prepared. There will not be an element of surprise. Although mathematical techniques give us a more scientific approach, but in this case, to select the samples, if I don't want to use mathematical techniques, I should maintain an element of surprise so that the client doesn't get an idea what I'm going to check. So in that case, it is a common practice to check large number of items towards the close of the year. Why so? There is a term. Please tell me, there is a term. What do we check at the year end? Large number of items at the year end to check for. What does the term is? To check for window dressing. I hope you all know what is window dressing. At the end of the year, which we call in Hindi Lipa Pochi. At the end of year, hodgepodge, whatever you want to do, just make it look all well. Pass fictitious entries and all. Make it look all good at the end of the year. So, we check a large number of items at the close of the year and develop cut-off procedures. Because year-end transactions are prone to high risk of misappropriation because it is only at this time when you finalize the results of your financial year, and it is only at this time in the period of February and March that you might resort to window dressing. The client might resort to window dressing. The non-statistical sampling technique is criticized usually that it is neither objective or nor scientific. It is kind of a bias. It depends upon professional judgment, and professional judgment will vary from person to person, subjective. The objective things are which have a certain standard or set of rules, science behind it. But something which is subjective, that will vary from auditor to auditor, team to team. So we cannot expect objectivity and same results from non-statistical sampling techniques, because there is a risk of personal bias in selection of sample items, and this risk cannot be eliminated. The closeness of the qualities produced projected by sample results with that of the whole population cannot be measured, because sample has not been selected mathematically. However, the auditor can state that auditors has a good experience and knowledge of the client's business, and therefore his professional judgment is enough. His professional acumen is enough to extract the sample and develop an opinion on the basis of that sample. It is quite simple, but sometimes it may not be a true representative of the total population, because there is no scientific ground and there could be personal bias. So there is a comparison between the two approaches, statistical and non-statistical sampling. Audit testing done through statistical approach is more scientific, obviously, than testing based entirely on auditors' own judgment, because the former, statistical, involves use of mathematical laws of probability to determine the appropriate sample size in different circumstances. And statistical sampling has reasonably wide application, where a population to be tested consists of a large number of similar items, or there are more transactions. For example, trade receivables confirmation, payroll checking, human resources payment, vouching of invoices, petty cash vouchers. So there could be a lot of petty cash vouchers in huge number, running into thousands, lakhs. How would you be able to check the 100%? You need a mathematical way to extract a sample out of that population and apply your audit procedures thereupon. So in case of statistical sampling, where we are using a science, a prescribed formula, there would be no personal bias, because every auditor, every team would be using that particular formula. Like your MCQ questions, what is right, everybody has to answer that. But in descriptive questions, subjective questions, every student writes answer in his or her own way. So that is why your MCQs are known as objective questions and your descriptive are known as subjective questions. The same way, objective is where what is right, that is conclusive. But what is subjective is based upon personal judgment. In larger organizations where huge transactions are there, statistical sampling is always recommended, as it is unbiased and samples selected are not prejudged. Because if you are using a mathematical formula, there is no personal judgment involved. Whatever you get is as a result of that formula, and anybody with different professional judgment, if uses that formula, they'll get the same result. For example, an auditor is verifying the purchases during the year, and he realizes that the purchase transactions in that year are more than 45,000 in number. And in such case, statistical sampling will be highly recommended. In the audit program, he's going to develop. In the audit program, he's going to hand over to his engagement team that no, don't go to the client and start checking each and every transaction. And you'll be sitting over there for the whole month checking 45,000 purchase invoices and transactions. This is the technique. These are the parameters on the basis of what you have to extract samples from those 45,000 entries, invoices, and apply your audit procedures as per the given audit program on those samples. And we will project the results to all the 45,000 entries on the basis of the results obtained from the sample. So in this case, we'll be using random sampling. We'll cover the random sampling in our next session. We'll be choosing random sampling in this case. The appropriateness. So where is statistical sampling appropriate to use? In what circumstances? Where is non-statistical sampling appropriate to use? How do we get to know that? In what situations? So in statistical sampling, the sample results are measurable, they are adequate and reliable as per our audit objectives. Whereas in non-statistical sampling, auditor's opinion is what is the most important. It determines the sample size. And we are not sure whether auditor's opinion is good for us and it will fulfill our audit objective. The sample might not give the results as desired because auditor's judgment varies from person to person, auditor to auditor. So in that case, where is statistical sampling appropriate? In statistical sampling, the sample size does not increase in proportion to increase in the size of the universe being tested. The sample selection is more objective and thereby more defensible. Because why is it defensible? Defensible means that can be proved because it is objective. It is based upon certain mathematical principles. It is based upon a science, logic. And wherever there you find logic, it can be completely it is defensible. You can prove it. Like you used to prove LHS equal to RHS. In the same manner, we can definitely prove it. Our logic, our method, our criteria, our base. And this particular type of statistical sampling, it helps us in estimating the minimum sample size required, keeping in mind the specific risk and kind of accuracy, the level of accuracy we require. You just change the parameters of that formula or that principle and you get the different sample sizes. Okay. It provides a means for deriving a calculated risk. Where there is maths, you can make calculations. Calculations made on the basis of formulae and therefore if there is a sampling error, what is a sampling error? That is what we have concluded from the sample, and if we apply that audit procedure on the whole universe, there is a bit deviation. Suppose there is a list of 20 accounts receivables and we check any 10. We get the results that almost 20% of the account balances debtors are on the verge of getting turned into bad debts. So that was my sample size. Now I check all the 20 accounts and I come to a conclusion not 20%, but 21% of the accounts are on the verge of turning into bad debts. That 1% is sampling error. The difference, the deviation of the population from the sample. The results we obtain from the population and the results we obtain from the sample, this deviation is known as sampling error. So statistical sampling provides us mathematical means to derive a calculated risk and corresponding precision. The lower the sampling error, the higher the precision. The higher the sampling error, the lower the precision, accuracy. And it provides a better measure of examining the whole data. There is non-statistical sampling. Appropriate and statistical sampling methods may not be appropriate. The auditor should not attempt to use statistical sampling when another approach is either necessary, where another approach is required, which might require this professional judgment, or where other approach will provide satisfactory result with less time and effort. For example, where exact accuracy is required, he need not go for statistical sampling. He has to derive samples on the basis of certain criteria as per the accuracy required, or in the case of legal requirements, the law under which we are auditing the entity, it requires us to check 100% of transactions or any such transactions which are more than 5% of the total value. We have to check each and every transaction. Or in the case of bank audits, when you will be starting your articleship training or you will be going for bank audits now in the month of April, stat audits, you will get to know that we check the loan accounts on the basis of sampling. The best example practically which you can do is in the case of stat bank audits. We apply a principle, but as per the directions of RBI, you will get to know that there is a certain percentage fixed by RBI that as per this percentage of loan or this much category of loans, you have to check at least a loan of the value of more than this specified percentage. You have to check all such loans. These fall under category of large loans. You have to check in detail all these loans and you have to report in your audit report about these loans. So there is a legal requirement. You cannot apply sampling over there. Sometimes the audit staff doesn't know well about the mathematical techniques or probability techniques that need to be used while sampling. They might take up wrong samples. In that case, you cannot use statistical sampling. It might become complex and inappropriate. Now, the last part for today's session is sampling risk. What is sampling risk? A risk, quite obvious, very easy to understand. A risk that the results we have obtained from the sample might not correspond to the results we have obtained from the population. Had we applied our audit procedures on the whole population instead of the sample, there could be a higher sampling error. There could be a deviation beyond our tolerance. The result sample is giving us and the result the population would have given us if we had applied our audit procedures on the entire population. That is a sampling risk. That the sample does not correspond to the population. That is sampling risk. And it will arise only when we are using sampling. If we are not using sampling, all other risks are non-sampling risks. So we know that sampling process is performed on test of controls. We have covered this. Why? To identify deviations from expected internal controls. What was the design of internal controls? How were these being implemented? And if there are any deviations from these internal controls. And we also apply sampling on test of details. This is at the financial statements level to identify misstatements of account balances which we get from the balance sheet and class of transactions which we find in the profit and loss. So test of details. So we apply sampling process on controls and to test the details. So what is sampling risk? The risk that the auditor's conclusion based on a sample may be different from the conclusion if the entire population was subjected to the same audit procedure. The sampling risk would always be there if we are using sampling in audit. This risk will always be in existence when auditor uses sampling technique in conducting his audit. This part is very important. If the acceptable sampling risk is low, larger sample size is needed. What is acceptable sampling risk? I don't have much risk appetite. I want my sampling risk to be as low as possible. There should not be sampling errors. So I would increase the scope of my work. I would increase the scope of my sample. I would increase the extent of my sample. So if I have the need of a very low acceptable sampling risk, I won't accept a high sampling risk. I accept a low sampling risk. Low sampling risk means the sample must correspond to the population. There should be hardly any deviations. So I'll check more. To check more of the population, I'll require more of the sample so that it covers major part of the population. To cover major part of the population, my sample size should be large. So this is what it proves. Now, what are the consequences of sampling risk? Sampling risk is there. So what kind of errors or erroneous conclusions? Erroneous conclusions means the auditor has formed a conclusion with errors. What could be such errors? So read with me and understand very effectively. In the case of a test of controls, the controls are more effective than they actually are. The auditor may come to a conclusion that controls are quite effective, but actually they are not effective. Or in the case of a test of details, the material misstatement does not exist, but in fact, it does exist. So auditor has come to a conclusion that the controls are effective, but actually the controls are not effective. So sampling error is high. Sampling risk has led to an erroneous conclusion by the auditor that good controls are good, but controls are not good in actual. There is no material misstatement as per the sample, but actually there is a misstatement. So why is the auditor considered with such result of sampling risk? Because it affects the audit effectiveness. The results of the audit are compromised. Effectiveness means something which is concerned with the results, and therefore it will give an inappropriate audit opinion because there is something wrong within the entity, but the auditor is giving a good opinion. So this means the auditor has placed over reliance on the internal controls. Now the auditor will place over reliance on the internal controls. The controls are actually not that good, which the auditor has concluded. If the auditor has concluded good controls, He's relying on those controls, but actually the controls are not good. So this reliance has turned into over-reliance. And this will further affect the quality of our audit. Now the opposite case, that controls are less effective than they actually are, or a material misstatement exists, but actually there is no such material misstatement. So the auditor has come to a conclusion using samples that controls are not effective. But actually, had we applied our audit procedures on the whole population, the controls were really good, barring some few areas. The auditor concluded, yes, there could be material misstatements. But all in all, the material misstatements were not there, or very few, which got covered in auditor samples incidentally. So now this kind of erroneous conclusion of sampling risk would affect audit efficiency. Audit efficiency is working during the audit. Effectiveness is related with result and efficiency is related with during the work. Now the auditor would be doing additional work than he was required. So that if he has come to a conclusion that material misstatement is there, controls are less effective, he can form his opinion. Now the controls are good, but the auditor does not agree to it. So there is under reliance on test of controls. And auditor would work in more details now. Now here the risk of giving wrong opinion is minimum because the auditor is working really good. But it will be more time consuming, hence less efficient. So when there is over reliance on internal controls, audit effectiveness is compromised. The auditor has a lenient approach. But if there is under reliance on internal controls, audit efficiency is compromised because auditor is more conservative in his approach. And auditor draws this conclusion from the samples. And thus, when sample does not correspond to the population, sampling risk comes into place. Yes, both the points are opposite of each other. This is what sampling risk is. So here is the crux of sampling risk. If there is a risk of sampling risk of under reliance, you are not relying on the test of controls much. So there could be incorrect rejection. You might be quite conservative in your approach and you might be rejecting some statements which are correct actually. There is inefficiency. Now, what is the risk of over-reliance? This is the first point. Under-reliance was the second point, which we covered in the previous slide. Over-reliance is the first point. Risk of incorrect acceptance, lenient approach, will accept the material misstatement to be good, and it will affect the effectiveness and gives us erroneous opinion in the audit report. The risk of erroneous opinion in the audit report is minimum in under-reliance in this kind of conclusion. It is higher in over-reliance. So this is the crux of sampling risk. Non-sampling risk, which is not related to sampling. You are using inappropriate audit procedures. There is misinterpretation at your end, or we fail to recognize a misstatement or deviation, human error. Non-sampling risk can never be mathematically measured because there is no formula to measure it. It could be human mistakes, misinterpreting the sample results. You have a sample, but you are misinterpreting the results derived from the sample. You are applying those audit procedures which are not required to be applied, which are not in line with the objectives of the audit. And you have gotten information which is erroneous, which is not correct, wrong information, and you are using it in your work, sampling work. So, for example, erroneous confirmation from the management. You ask for a confirmation of a debtor or a creditor balance or a bank balance from the management, and they are confirming wrong balance. And you're using that balance in your technique. You are relying on a wrong information. That is non-sampling risk. So this is what we have covered today. Sampling risk, non-sampling risk. We'll finish off for today over here, our first session, and we are left with we have covered three parts: the general part, the sampling approaches, and the sampling risk today. In the next session, we'll be finishing off with this chapter with the last part remaining and a more detailed part, the sampling process. How does the sampling process work? How do you design as an auditor? How do you design a sample? How do you assume? How do you calculate what should be the sample size? And how should the sample be selected using what methods? Then what should be your audit procedures? And if there are any deviations and misstatements, then applying the results of the sample on the population and evaluating the results thereon. So step by step, this is a sampling process which we'll be covering in our next session. And hopefully, we'll definitely cover one case study as well on this chapter, audit sampling. We'll definitely try. I'll make sure that I bring you a case study to strengthen the concepts we have gained in this chapter, audit sampling. Okay? Fine. Any doubts? We are here for another 2 minutes. If there are any doubts, it's fine. Otherwise, we can wind up the session. Okay. Take care, everyone. Good night. Meet you tomorrow, and we'll finish this chapter. Thank you.